So we're live now. Very happy to have T L Huchu. It's Tendai, isn't it? The first.
It is Tendai. Thank you, Kaz.
Do you want to start us off with an introduction to yourself and your books?
Thank you for having me. This is like an author's version of a Friday night party. So I'm T L Huchu. I'm the author of the Edinburgh Nights trilogy, which mixes up um, action, adventure, a bit of mystery, ghosts, and all that kind of stuff. So the first book is The Library of the Dead. That came out in 2021, and it introduces you to the lead character, Ropa Moyo, who's a young ghost stoker. She speaks with ghosts for a living, and children are going missing in Edinburgh. And this sort of gets her roped into the world of Scottish magic. She's not a proper magician, but it leads her into this magical world. She discovers an occult library and battles villainous villains like the Midnight Milkmen. The second in the series is Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments. And in this installment, Ropamoy has become an apprentice to Sir Ian Callender, Scotland's top magician. Well, she's not actually an apprentice, she's an unpaid intern, which is a bit of a hassle because she's from a working class background and desperately needs a bit of cash to support her family. But there's these kids from a magical school that are getting sick mysteriously, and Ropa has to investigate and battle more villainous villains. Book number 3 in the series, The Mystery at Dunvegan Castle. So both the first books are set in Edinburgh, and this is the first one to leave the city. There's an academic/professional conference happening on the Isle of Skye, where all the top Scottish magicians and a few international guests come through. The guest of honor is an Ethiopian wizard who gives Scottish magic with this ancient magical scroll written by the Queen of Sheba. Unfortunately, that's stolen, and a librarian is murdered, and Ropa has to investigate. Yeah, so that is the Edinburgh Night series so far, and I'm currently working on book 4.
Which we were talking about before we went live, didn't we? Because I was saying that makes my heart glad that you're working on book 4, because I'm a big fan of the series.
Thank you. You're very kind, and as I said before, it is kicking my backside at the moment. You think it gets easier over time, but I swear it gets a lot more difficult because each of the novels has sort of like got an individual plot thread, but then you've got the overarching series plot. So I've got all these balls that I've thrown up in the air, and now I'm desperately trying to catch them, and bring the series to a satisfying conclusion. So I've been writing myself into these alleyways, these sort of like corners and stuff. It's been mad. It's been hectic. So actually speaking with someone um, is a bit refreshing because I've spent all day talking to imaginary characters in my head. So forgive me if I have this wild look in my eyes.
That's fine. Did I read somewhere that Roper started as a short story?
Yeah. So I started out writing literary fiction. This is my first novel was called The Hairdresser of Harare. That came out in 2010. But I'd always been working in genre SFF and crime in the short form. What I told to myself then, when I was a younger writer, was I needed to develop my skills. And I looked at literary fiction and said, okay, so this is the area where I'll practice my character work. I looked at crime and said, this is where I practice my plotting, and SFF as the area where I practiced my world building. Now, this isn't to say these elements are exclusive to a particular genre, but it's kind of like going to the gym and picking a different piece of apparatus. You're working the body, but you kind of put an emphasis on different muscles. At least that's how I looked at it. Um, and over time, all those skills started coming together. So I also consider the short form as my R&D department. You can imagine writing a novel takes quite a bit of time, and you're grinding through it. But with the short form, you can experiment with voice, with style, with form, with anything you want, really, over sort of like, you know, a short sprint instead of the marathon that is a novel. And in 2015, I published a story called Ghost Stalker, which was set in my hometown of Bindura, Zimbabwe. I was born and raised in this little town that's about 80 kilometers, 40 odd miles north of Harare, the capital. It's a sleepy place with just a giant gold mine and a giant nickel mine. And that particular story had the proto roper, a girl who uses the mbira, which is this. Some people call it the thumb piano. It's a wooden board with metal keys. That's very important in Shona spirituality. It's how you talk to the ancestors and things like that. Um, and she was just delivering messages, and I really liked the voice. It had a zingy voice that grabbed me, but I didn't know if I could do a novel with it. Fast forward a year or two later, 2016, 17, I published another story called The Library of the Dead, which was set in Harare. There's this national heroes acre in Zimbabwe where they bury these old guys that fought in the war of liberation. And I was playing with the idea of using bodies and cemeteries as repositories of history. I'm one of those weird people that likes wandering around old graveyards and reading the inscriptions. It tells us something about people in a specific period of time. And they're very peaceful places as well. So I knew these two stories were set in the same universe. And around about 2017, I started working on a novel, but I wanted to set it in Bindura. It didn't quite work for me. It's a very small town with very little going on. So I moved it to the place that I know second best. I've lived in Edinburgh near enough 20 years now. And while Edinburgh is not like a big city like London or Manchester or Birmingham, what it lacks in its sort of like speciality is it's got this temporal depth of history that you can mine. And as soon as I did that, yeah, the story sang because the character's voice changed, obviously, and but all these interesting elements came together, and yeah, I had a great time writing the first one. It was a lot more fun than writing book four. I'll tell you that, because there was this blank canvas to explore.
We've got some hellos. We've got hellos from Sam, Donna, who was also said that your books sound cool. Donna, they're really good. Laura said hello, and Patricia said hello. You may have met Patricia at events in Edinburgh. She's one of our
All right.
admins. Pretty sure she has been to see you.
Hi,
Um,
Patricia. That's amazing. Is she based down in Yorkshire as well, or out here in Edinburgh?
she lives in Fife somewhere.
That's all right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Yeah.
Yeah, she says you have met.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. And the next time we meet, please do give me a shout. I have the
Uh,
memory of a sieve.
yeah, she lives in Rosyth. Um,
And Rosette, all right, that's a nice place to live. Yeah, it's beautiful.
yeah. So I think she'll have been to see you at like Edinburgh Book Festival
Or at
or something.
Chimera, maybe.
Yeah, or at Chimera.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a great
It does.
festival.
It looks like a really good festival. I always get like envy when I see the Chimera Festival kind of lineups because it always looks really good.
Oh,
Um,
you've got to come up for it. I know they also do online events, but I've been for 3 years now checking stuff out, and you get to meet authors that you've read and who you love. But it has a great vibe and a great energy, and the setting of it, it's in a sort of like small um, square that belongs to the University of Edinburgh, up in the Pleasance. So you get these interesting interactions with people at the bar. It's wonderful.
Oh, it sounds
Yeah.
great. In the sorry about that. In the books, you have Roper learning Scottish magic, which is very different to her kind of ancestral magic. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the kind of Scottish magic system?
Yeah. So Soropa lives in a caravan in a slum with a grandma. There is a story there somewhere with the grandma, um, and she's teaching her Shona magic, and that's how Ropa does her ghost stalking. But that's not considered real magic by Scottish magicians. They kind of practice a different brand, which they terms scientific magic, which is an oxymoron, but we'll just roll with it. So because she's found an in with this other thing, it kind of leads to a bit of an issue with her gran, who's been teaching her this stuff, but she's like, yeah, but I want to do this other stuff because that's where the money and sort of like the prestige is. But in the second novel, you get more of a sense that there are different kinds of magic, and one of the questions she's asked when she's trying to become an apprentice to say Ian Calendar is, what types of magic are there, and you realize there's sort of like some faith-based magics. You've got scientific magic. You've also got the head librarian, Dr. Maige, who believes in the mathematical universe hypothesis, which is, we are this universe is a manifestation of maths, and therefore magic is just us performing these sort of like um, mathematical algorithmic um, things that we're doing. So what I wanted to do was to have if you look at the world, if I look at how I was raised, right, I was raised in a very conservative Catholic family, no
Mhm.
longer religious. I had enough of that. But at the time, that was my worldview, um, and it worked. And then I left that, and the world still works. So I wanted to use magic as a proxy for that kind of worldview in which people approach the same problems from different angles. It just depends on where you happen to come from or what tradition you happen to be raised in. Yeah.
Do you because there's like proper equations and things in the books, or like made up equations. Did you make those up?
I did make those up. So you've got the Somerville equation, named for the Scottish polymath Mary Somerville. You'll find a lot of the scientific magic is based on work by Enlightenment age, sort of like 18th, 19th century Scottish scientists, and I'm riffing off that. Uh, I got one equation in there. The editor was kind of like, no, we can't. There would have been a lot more equations, but I understood that because it can get baffling and a bit too much, especially with the digressions on how the magic works. In fact, initially when I started, I wanted to create a magic system that was so difficult and so dense that you could hardly use it for anything. You could just talk about it, but it wasn't really useful for much. But obviously, when you're writing a novel, you've got to give the reader a bit more to go on. So I had to modify that. But what I've done subsequently through books 2 and 3, and now book 4, is highlight a certain aspect of that particular equation. So we're always going back to the sum of the equation and saying, well, it could be the practitioner's potential, it could be the time element in it, it could be what they call the agitative threshold and the world's natural resistance to magic. So each book kind of gives you a little bit more on that equation, and that's what I kind of snuck in there. Otherwise, yeah, would have ended up with some kind of dodgy math textbook.
As a scientist, it makes my heart a little bit happy when I find things like equations in books.
Yeah,
Um,
it's also fun for the author to work in, to work with, but I also have to confess that Edinburgh as a city is a big part of it, right? As I was designing the magic system, um, one of the things I did is just tramp around Edinburgh trying to find locations for some of these um, spaces, like the library or the headquarters for the Society of Skeptical Inquirers and things like that. And I've described the process of writing this book as a sort of call and response between me and the city. There's this weird thing that happens where you when you go out and you see something. A good example is I was looking for a cool entrance for the Library of the Dead. So I went about these cemeteries in the city looking for something that caught my eye. And I saw this nice, beautiful, round mausoleum that looked a little bit different from anything else that was there. And I thought, yeah, that's my entryway. It turns out that is David Hume, the philosopher's mausoleum. And so now I had to work Hume into the story. So the Society of Magicians is called the Society of Skeptical Inquirers because if you think of Hume, you think of empiricism and skepticism and that kind of stuff. There is a commercial dimension to the magic because who was Hume's best mate? Adam Smith, the economist slash philosopher. So all these little things start coming in, and it can get a bit messy as you working through it. But I think the world that we live in is messy anyway. So you get these little elements that kind of cohere into a certain picture. One of the things that I'm cognizant of is the reader in reading this text never actually gets a clear picture of the world that the the story is playing out in or how everything works because we're always working from Roper's POV point of view. So even our knowledge of the magic and the systems there is limited by what Roper has managed to learn because she's an autodidact. She's learning it herself, as opposed to these people that have gone to formal magic school. Yeah.
yeah, she does meet people who've been to formal magic school, though, doesn't she? Because she gets involved with the magical schools in the second book.
Yeah, and they are snobbish as you can expect, and a little full of themselves. But one of the reasons I had Priya, who's another character that I love in the story, is I also wanted to have someone close to Roper who had a better understanding of how the magic is actually supposed to work. So you'll notice that when there is fight scenes and things like that, usually, unless there is a reason for Roper to have to tackle something herself, usually you have Priya or some other magician like Calendar handle things because it's important to me in writing this. We all like to root for a good underdog, but what I didn't want was to have the one, that character who comes in, doesn't have any formal training, but all of a sudden is better than all these people that have done it. So at no point is Roper ever going to be better than the proper magicians around her. She kind of has to improvise and be a little bit scrappy, but where she can, she'll get help from her friends who know the stuff much better than she does. And I think that's a slightly more realistic depiction. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. Do we find, as part of the overarching story across the books, will we find out more about her gran's backstory as we go on? Because her gran is like a mysterious lady in the first few.
I can tell you hand on heart, that's what's been driving me mad in book four. So we first meet Gran in the caravan knitting. She's always working with her hands, knitting something, and we know she has this history of sort of creating things for the community around her and giving away the stuff. There's several curious things that happen in book one. Ropa is gifted a magical scarf by Sir Ian Callender, and again, knitwear. When the book starts, Gran is knitting a um, a cardigan, which happens to fit a certain someone at the end of the book. So we get the sense that Gran knows a lot more than she's telling on, than she's letting on. But Roper, I was a teenager once, and I didn't think my grandparents were cool or worth listening to. I thought they were just old. They'd always been old, and they hadn't lived. Um, so Roper doesn't quite see. I mean, there's so many hints, and she really needs to be asking her grandma about her history, but she doesn't because it's her grandma, and she doesn't care. But by the time we get to book four, all these things are gradually coming together. So yeah, in short, you will get an explanation of who Gran was and what her backstory is. Yeah.
Will she then sort of go back into learning a little bit more about her kind of Shona magic as well? Because I feel like that's a really interesting angle that would be, as a fan, would be interesting to read about.
You should write this with me, Kaz. You're like spilling my bag of tricks. But
Sorry.
so what's happened is Ropa has moved away from Shona magic. And the question is, will she come back to it at some point? Um, but we see certain hints in she's not really good at the actual Scottish magic that she's learning because she hasn't been to a formal magic school. When she gets in trouble, she always resorts to tricks that she's learned from her gran, even though she doesn't seem to realize that this is what she's doing. But she'll always default back to something that her gran taught her, and this is what gets her out of situations. Yeah.
It's like quite a nice, like, sort of, you've got your own magical sport as well, haven't you? In it, so you know how we've got in other sort of magical schools like their own sport, but you embrace the Scottish love of rugby in yours. Is there like
Yeah, that's a funny one. So there's four schools of magic, and I tried to, because historically, Scotland had four unis. You had Edinburgh, St Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen. So the schools of magic are kind of tied into to that particular history. Um, and there is rugby, but I used to play rugby union in high school. Um, Blissfully unaware until I moved over here that there was this thing called rugby league, which I think is a Yorkshire thing as well, a northern thing. Um, and I thought it was an abomination that you had a whole nother form of rugby going on. So when I decided to have this sport, because in book three they had this academic conference and you've got school kids there, so I thought there should be something involving the kids, and there's this game of rugby, which is yet another form of rugby, a sort of like magical variety. But again, in that particular chapter, you've got Priya trying to explain it to Ropa. Ropa doesn't quite get it. So I've had people ask me, what are the rules of the game? And I'm like, yeah, I know the specific rules of the game, but I'm always having to stick with the point of view character because it's a first person narration, and Ropa is being told about this by someone. I think of times when you know how during the Olympics, right? You sit there and you watch stuff that you otherwise might never watch. Like you sit there and you watch dressage or curling or that kind of stuff. And the commentators will be going on, yeah, you kind of get it, but you don't really know the rules around it because by the time it's done, you've moved on to something else. And so the rugby in there it is by design meant to be a little bit baffling. Again, you get hints of what is going on, but you don't quite get the full picture.
my dad tells that rugby story, but in reverse, because he grew up in Yorkshire and grew up playing. rugby league at school, and then when he joined the army, he learned that rugby union existed.
All right. I- I've had people say, and I don't know how true this is. Maybe you would know, Kaz, that the transition from league to union is a little bit easier than the other way around.
I don't know. I think there's been a few more transition from league to union, but it's
Uh,
yeah, there's a lot of switching in between. I think now it used to be that if you swapped one way, you couldn't swap back.
all right. Well, I hope none of my magicians decide to go into union or league because the rules are quite different there.
You've got some questions in the stream. Donna said, I think this is when we were talking about the equation for the magic. She said, aren't you worried you'll accidentally create something lethal?
Something lethal. You remind me, Donna, of you remember when the CERN, the particle collider was, when they were commissioning it, like and there was this fear that there would be a black hole created and would all get spaghettified inside of it, and it didn't happen. Or I know Oppenheimer is, I haven't been to watch it, but I've I've heard about the stories of like the makers of the atomic bomb, and there was the fear that there'll be some kind of chain reaction and the whole atmosphere would ignite and that would be the end of us all. It hasn't happened, thank goodness. So I'm not quite worried. Yeah, but if that were possible, that would be like really cool.
I think everyone is suspicious of scientists that they're going to do something like really lethal one day.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes from this thing that we have, right? There's awe in which, I mean, I scraped by with a D in A level physics. I'm not great at the practice of science, but I do love reading about it. And I read sort of like voraciously on different, you know, I like getting these explanations from people that actually do the work, and those are the concepts that I end up playing around with. But we're all kind of in awe because the world that we live in, right, is, the phones that we use, the TV, the internet, the vehicles that we use. It's designed by these people, these minds. And for us mere mortals, we don't quite know what's going on. So I think we are right to be a little bit suspicious of what they're up to.
But I think that's what draws us to things like books about magic and stuff like that, isn't it? Because science and magic are kind of very similar in a way, like they are doing all these things that we don't quite know how it works, but just magically happens. And the people
Yeah,
who are doing them are like really special and cool and interesting because they can do these amazing things.
yeah. There is that link, isn't there? I think at the limits of our knowledge as people. I used to, in my 20s, when I'd given up religion and all that, I used to think of myself as a very logical, rational person, which was complete and utter bollocks. I mean, at the far limits of your knowledge, that's where the superstition kicks in. But that's what it is to be human. I mean, if you think about it, it's mad that we're in this massive, unfathomable universe and we get these little glimpses of what's going on. Someone might say, oh, Newton might give us a law of gravity and stuff like that. But fundamentally, none of us knows why we're here, how we got here. There is this mysteriousness built into existence, that, you know, we all spend our lives thinking what the hell is going on and no one ever figures it out. We just get little hints here and there and poof, your time's up. So, but I've digressed needlessly.
Patricia wanted to know if Roper's sister appears in book 4.
Roper's sister. So, um, in book one, the sister is there because they live together in the caravan. And in book two, she gets a great opportunity to go to off to boarding school to study proper magic, which Ropa doesn't want her sister to go, but it's a great opportunity. Ironically, Isri, the little sister, doesn't want to go. She wants to stay in Edinburgh in this slum where she's got all her mates, and she wants to go back to the regular school that she enjoys. Isri might well be much smarter than Ropa is, so she's shunted off to school, and that just leaves Ropa and her grandma, which kind of changes the dynamic of what happens in the caravan. Even though I think Gran picks up a boyfriend in book two. Um, in book three, they're supposed to meet, but that doesn't quite happen because you know of events that the murder and stuff. So in book four or five, she might reappear. There was a point, and this is why I alluded to the fact that I've got all these balls that I threw up in the air, and now I'm desperately trying to catch them. It's that is one of the things I'm grappling with as to when and how the little sister reappears and what she's learned in her time away at magic school.
The one of the questions we often ask on our talks, because we interview lots of crime authors, is about the research process. Is that a little bit different for you because you kind of built your own world? Do you have to do as much research for your book where you've kind of built your own world and rules and systems, or
Yeah, I think you still need to. There has to be some kind of um, logical coherence to the world. So there's a reason why in book one, after Europa does a job, gets a bit of money, she meets a bunch of cops that take the money off her. So you get the sense already that these aren't your friendly bobbies on the beat. There's this dystopian thing where the police can be relied upon to handle crime as would happen um, in a normal society. And that's the reason why you've got Ropa doing these private investigations. Um, so you sort of set these kind of rules, and then it's like setting up a chessboard, right? So you've got a square that's you've got this great big square that's got little black and white squares in it, and then you've got these pieces, and you decide how they can move. And but by limiting them and saying, okay, the bishop can only move this way, the knight can only move in that way, you then have something logical, but that there's an infinite range of possibilities as to what you can do with that. The books use a lot of history. I'm fascinated by the Scottish Enlightenment. For those that might not know it as well, there's this, Scotland used to be, a shithole country, as Trump would call it, in the 17th century. Right, it was the poorest nation in Western Europe. Fast forward into there's a long history there. Flash forward into the 18th century where it joins in this union with England, and there's this flourishing of scientific thought. It becomes part of the empire and all the wealth that's flowing in, and that's where you get a lot of this cool stuff happening. So the history is a huge element of it, but what I also end up doing is putting my own little twist to it. So what I like to do is I like to take something that is factual and then kind of bend it a little bit. So you get this mix of slightly factual things and things that aren't, and that's the play and the balance that I'm trying to achieve. But yeah, you can bet that there is a lot of history. I spend a lot of time thinking about what's actually possible, what's not, what are the rules that I can bend, and what are the rules that are absolutely static, that are completely um, unbreakable. And I hope that's what gives the work a sort of logical coherence.
Oh, I think there's like a deep love of Edinburgh that kind of shines through the book because Edinburgh is sort of almost has a kind of character of its own in the stories, doesn't it? It's like deeply important, kind of to the stories and how they unfold.
I'm really happy that shows through. You're gonna make me blush or something. Yeah, I I moved to Edinburgh, so I did a little stint in England, staying in Reading, and you can imagine, you know, I moved over at a time where there was like this great socio-political upheavals going on in Zimbabwe, but I always had a great love of books, literature, and reading. Um, I was fortunate to go to these schools when I was younger that had really good libraries, even though the works in them might have been a little dated. So you can imagine when I got over here and like you've got, I still have memories of going into Waterstone's Reading and thinking I've arrived in Mecca, like seeing all these books. Now we have a couple of bookstores in Harare, but nothing on that scale. And I hadn't even done Waterstone's Piccadilly or any of the really sort of like gigantic ones. And that's why I got like maybe that's the reason Europa is a bit of an autodidact because I got some of my education there. You can imagine finding these works that a book here costs about the equivalent of an hour's wage on the minimum wage. Um, in Zimbabwe, books are a lot more expensive. You're looking at about 15 or 20 US dollars, where the average salary for a civil servant might be $200. So to buy a book, if you're an average worker, it might cost you more than 10% of your salary. So they're a great big luxury. And I was totally devouring them. I moved to Edinburgh to do uni. I studied podiatry, so feel free to put in a few foot fetish jokes in the comments if you will. But my image of first coming into the city, right? You've got the Scots Monument on Princess Street. The fact that Waverley Station itself is maybe the only station in the world that's named after a series of novels, right? You have this city that has a great literary history, and I didn't know these things at the time. So you grow up on cartoons like Jekyll and Hyde, that links you to Stevenson. Now you're in the place where these authors lived and worked in, and that in itself is a magical thing. I think writing, literature, it's a cultural thing, all right. And so being in a place that was so steeped in this thing that I love was energizing in terms of sort of like classical authors, even the contemporary um, authors that were working then, and I feel because I had a rough start to it. Simply because it takes a while to learn your craft. I'm still learning my craft, and you're getting those early rejections as you're doing work and you're sending it out there, and it really breaks your heart. Um, but the stuff that I was writing then was goddamn awful. But what kept me going was I was in this space that had, I think at the time, I don't know if it still is. Edinburgh was the UNESCO City for Literature. I don't know if it still has that designation. So there were all these little things where, these moments where I would be so close to giving up on the writing, and then the city would reel me back in. Um, and I learned quite a bit about it over time. It grows on you, and there is this magical moment. When you move to a place for the first time, and it's kind of baffling, and you get bits and pieces, and then um, it starts coming together into something that's a little bit more coherent. Uh, but I'm always discovering new stuff. I remember during COVID, which thank God we passed that. I would run. That's my other passion. I love running. I would run into the city. There was no traffic. There was no one about. and I was going into these areas that I normally would avoid, because you know how cities are designed, you kind of get channeled along certain commuter routes. But now I was freer to explore it, and there is always something new. So the books are, in a sense, a love letter to the city, and I'm glad that it comes across as a sort of character, because there is that call and response that I told you about, these little things that I weave into the narrative. And I'm fascinated by Scottish history and the culture. I absolutely love it. The fact that such a tiny little nation can have a huge impact on a global scale is it blows my mind. Um, and again, you keep encountering these concepts that, for example, learning mathematics in high school, those bloody logarithms, right? And then you've got Napier, who discovered them, you know and you can go see where he's buried in the city center. So it's all those little things that kind of heighten um this feeling and this depth of emotion that you feel for this space. It's given me so much. Yeah, if I had to move from here, it would you'd be tearing a part of myself from myself, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. And I think that one of the joys of COVID, if there were joys of COVID, is that we all had time to explore our areas that little bit more, or like the freedom too. Like I definitely discovered more about the bit where I live because we just roamed more and had the time to.
Yeah, I mean, even just hearing birdsong in the city, in the mornings and the afternoons, which normally doesn't happen for all the traffic. I think it gave us an opportunity to observe the city spaces in ways that we normally wouldn't. I mean, I dabbled in that whole psychogeography thing at some point in my early 30s, and I think for anyone with an interest in that, the lockdown period was a rewarding space in which you could you would move in the city differently, because maybe the bus routes that you normally take are, you know they've been shut down, or you don't get the frequency of the service that was there before, and you might have to walk it, or you might be prepared to go to a different store, just because you want to take your hours worth of exercise on that particular day. So you start seeing things radically differently, and now things have sort of normalized. But one of the things I moan is the lack of those quiet periods where you just had this sense of peace and quiet. But there's little pockets. If you like graveyards like I do in Edinburgh, there's these old graveyards that are kind of like parks. You go, you sit in them, and you almost forget that you're in the city.
I love things like that. There's this really lovely park slash graveyard in the university in Leeds. It's called St George's Fields, and it can't be dug up. I think there are cholera victims there, so it just stays there in the middle of the university. And it's just this lovely, peaceful, beautiful place to go and sit, like in the middle of the city.
Yeah, and there is joy in sort of that discovery of those kinds of places. I went up to North Merkestone Cemetery as I was doing my research. Like the last scene of book one is set on what used to be called Gorgie City Farm is now called Gorgie Love Gorgie Farm, because there's just this little area where they've got farm animals and stuff for the kids to check out, which is really cool in the middle of the city. And there's a cemetery right next to it that I hadn't visited before, and it has these um, Commonwealth graveyards, but you also get to enjoy a bit of the trees, the holly that's there, or the old yews that are in it. um yeah, those spaces are very very they can be comforting. I mean, they remind you of your own mortality. But you also get a sense that when all this is done, there will be peace and calm to come.
Do you so you were saying that you had like a lot of rejection that made you feel down, but now the books are doing quite well. I mean, you're appearing at like lots of festivals alongside lots of other quite well respected authors. How does that feel like now to be sort of at that point? I mean, I know you can probably always want to do more, but you do have like a stalwart of fans and things like that.
It's sort of surreal, maybe even anxiety inducing. I think what happens over time is this thing that I got into it a little naively. Um, no, I didn't know much about the literary world when I started. I'll just go into Waterstones. Back in those days, I would buy a copy of the Writers and Artists Yearbook. I didn't have like a laptop or the internet at home, so you'd kind of go through these pages reading about how to submit and stuff like that. And it had a list of like UK, Ireland agents, and I think some in the States as well, and a list of publishers and those things. And so my first ever manuscript that I wrote, um, which I thought at the time was a work of monumental genius, but I've since looked at it again and it was really bad. Um, but yeah, I wrote it with that ego and stuff that a young man has, sent it out and got rejected. And my first ever rejection, which I've kept, was because what you had to do back then is you had to print out the manuscript, like three sample chapters. You had to write your cover letter. Then you had to include a self-addressed and stamped envelope so that they send you a response. Um, and so I sent stuff to about 10 or 20 agents. And the first one I got back, there's that sense of recognition that, oh, this is my own handwriting. It's that thing that I sent out. And your heart skips, and you're like, you're young, you're naive, you think it's easy, you think this thing that you've done is great. And I opened it. It was my own letter sent back to me with a line scribbled across it that just said, "Not for us." Ouch. And then the rest come back, and after about like the third or the fourth, you kind of twig what's going on, and then it's brutal. And now you don't even want to see those envelopes coming back. So you get the rejection, and it sucks, but I think it's necessary because that's what turns you into a better writer, because you need to work on your craft. There's all these different elements of writing that I hadn't mastered, and you get the idea that the bar is much higher than you thought it was. So that dread, when I speak with other writers, it seems the dread that maybe you've kind of scammed or you've gamed the system and you're a bit of a fraud and you're going to get caught out at some point. That feeling doesn't seem to go away. You think, okay, maybe I've gotten lucky this once, but I'm going to get caught out. And I think there's a distinction between maybe the writing itself, the creative process, which is you, and the white blank page. I work in my living room, um, me in my living room typing away. That's, that can be grueling and difficult, uh, but I still derive a lot of joy from it. There is the other end for it, where the other side of it, which is writing for publication and all that comes with it. I think that's where a lot of your neurosis as a writer tends to stem from. It's not from the work itself, the perceptions of the work. Will it sell well? Will you, like with this particular series? I first got a two-book deal. So if the readers hadn't been kind enough to buy enough copies to keep it going, that would have been it. Uh, but then they keep that going. So there's always these things at the back of your mind that you kind of have to shunt aside when you're doing the creative work to try to discover that naive joy of doing it. I love telling stories, and I'm grateful that I can get to do this for work. I play for a living, and it's afforded me these opportunities as well because I have a love for literature. And so I get these opportunities where I meet other writers and talk to them about their works, and I'm totally fanning out. Um, but what will always ground me is, first and foremost, I'm a reader more than anything. Even if I were never to get published ever again, I would always go back into that spot where I'm going into bookstores and buying books, that because you know that's what I love about literature. This other thing is, it's a thing that I do, um, but that's the foundation I try to build everything off. Yeah.
So we'll come back to your love of literature, but you said book 4 and 5. Do you have an idea of how many books there will be in the series with Roper?
And this, okay, so I designed it as a 5 book series. What do they call that? Is it a pentalogy? I think it is. Uh, but because I got this 2 book deal and another 2 book deal, what I did is I made sure that the 4th book would give you an ending, a satisfying conclusion, and that's one of the things I've been struggling to work into. We will have talks at some point with the publisher to see if I can get to do the 5th. Um, I'm not a fan of those never-ending series. I like something tight that you can binge on. I like a conclude. That's one of the reasons why you know years ago in my 20s I got into EastEnders, but you then realize this thing is never going to stop. It's going to keep going on and on and on. And yeah, I left it. I want to have something that you can have on your bookshelf and it's a coherent whole at some point. So at the rate we're going, my agent is pretty optimistic that when the time comes, we'll be able to get the last one done. But by book 4 anyway, you are going to get a satisfying conclusion to this tale. Yeah.
Okay, that's both good and sad to know.
Well, I'll never sort of like take away the possibility that there will be other works in that universe. I'm fortunate in November I get to speak with Victoria Schwab about the Fragile Threads of Power, and that's part of Shades of Magic series, which was a trilogy, and years later she's come in with something else. So there'll always be that kind of possibility, but at this stage, there's a story that I set out to tell, and I want the reader to have that conclusion, because what I don't want is, that thing that happens, I don't know, with Netflix, where something does well, and then you get another season and you're like, hang on a minute, you're just keeping this thing going, but it's done. um no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to cheat the reader. And as you've been um chatting with me, Kaz, it's clear that there are these threads within the narrative that you've spotted, and there's certain kinds of resolutions that you're waiting for. And I think it would be a dick move if I kept postponing this thing or kind of shifting it into something else without tying those things off. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. One of our other favourite questions that we like to ask, and this is where I'm going back to love literature, is what you read this year that you've really enjoyed.
What I've read this year that I've enjoyed.
Give us some book recommendations.
There is 2, actually. The first one, and this is completely by coincidence. So I've told you about my love for literature, at midnight, I am interviewing Wole Talabi about his debut novel, Shigidi. Now, Talabi lives in Malaysia. He's a Nigerian engineer that lives out there, and we're doing this event for a bookstore in the States. So because of the time zone things, it's gonna have to be midnight. I'd been following his short fiction for years, and he's this like award-winning short fiction writer, and he was doing like really interesting hard SFF. So when this book when I got the opportunity to blurb this book, I was surprised that it's a work of fantasy, and it's this wonderful heist novel that I think will appeal to readers of Neil Gaiman's American Gods. So you've got Shigidi, who's a minor nightmare deity. Now the Yoruba culture, the Nigerians, they have these orishas, these gods that are just as interesting and as messed up as the Greek gods are. And he's told this narrative fusing that mythology, but because he lives in Malaysia, so you get some Asian gods as well, and then you marry that up with. I mean, it's a heist novel. There's a precious artifact, the brass head of Obalufon, that they're after. That's in the British Museum, but that means they also have to deal with English gods, and so it's just a wonderfully done novel that if you enjoyed, say, Ocean's 12 and Ocean's 11 and all that, I think you would love this. Or if you're a fan of American gods, then you will get that sense of gods struggling in this modern age, struggling for relevance. It's very well done and beautifully written. I've also enjoyed A.Y. Chao's Shanghai Immortal, which is set in the 1920s. You know, is that the jazz age or the swing age? It's 1920s Shanghai, um, and this was a period where Shanghai was kind of like a center for all these different competing foreign powers and the local Chinese themselves. So the world building is fascinating because you've got your normal Shanghai and you've got an underworld that's there that's filled with folk spirits and these creatures from Chinese mythology mashed up with vampires and all these different things. And it's got Lady Jin, who is a feisty, um, mouthy lead character, which would obviously appeal to me. And again, it's so wonderfully written. So those two books have blown my mind this year. I've absolutely loved them.
I'm just writing them both down.
Yeah, so that's Shanghai Immortal by A.Y. Chao and Shigidi by Wale Talabi.
Got them. They both sound exactly like the kind of thing I would like to read.
I, I,
We've
th-
got.
I think you'll enjoy them.
I'm sure it will. I loved American Gods, so you sold me with that reference. We've got 1 minute left. Do you want
Oh
to
no.
remind people what they're going to go away and buy? If they've been watching this chat and they've been saying that your books sound cool, what are they off to get?
All right. They can get The Library of the Dead. That is the first in the series. Or if they've done that, you've got Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments, the second one, or the latest one, which is The Mystery at Dunvegan Castle. I've had some readers start at various points, and they kind of have a standalone thing where you can start with the third and work your way back. Um, but hopefully, you start with The Library of the Dead and work your way up.
I think you need to. You probably can read them alone, but I would read them in order. I think you get more of the world sort of richness if you read them in order.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and you've got a couple of people saying they're definitely going away to have a look at them.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the books when you get to them. And I'm grateful to you for inviting me to this. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I was just going to finish off by saying thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. You've made my Friday night.
Thanks.